The second class of biomolecules is going to be lipids. Okay? Lipids are non-polar, they're hydrophobic, so they don't dissolve in water very easily. So think about butter you use for cooking or oils, right? They don't really mix with water. So these are some common types of lipids. Fats are lipids coming from animals, oils coming from plants, waxes, you can find the waxes on the leaf surface, phospholipids, a very important component in cell membrane, and the steroids, some of the hormones are steroids, they're very important. We'll talk about that in details. So let's look at fats first, okay? A very, very common group of lipids. We all have fats, right? Some people may have very low fat content, but everybody has fat. So what's the main purposes for having fats in living organisms? Mostly animals, right? Fats are a very good storage for energy. Okay? So animals store their extra energy in fats. That's why we kind of grow fat, right? When you eat a lot and then you don't use all the energy from those food, your body can convert that into fat. Now, here's an interesting fact. So people may say, well, I don't eat a lot of fats. I don't eat butter. I don't eat meat. I'm vegetarian or I'm vegan. But again, if you eat a lot of other stuff like carbohydrates, we'll talk about that in pretty soon. That's broken down to a lot of glucose, right? So your body has a way to convert glucose to fats. Okay, so you can still grow fats. So fats are also known as triglycerides. There you go, triglycerides. So I'll talk about why they're called triglycerides. There you go. So that explains the structure. So this is a glycerol. Okay? It's basically a type of alcohol. Now, definitely not the alcohol that you drink. Alcohol that we drink is ethanol. Okay? So it only has 2 carbons. But over here you have 3 carbons, and for each carbon you have a hydroxyl group. Okay, so it's just a special type of alcohol. And this is fatty acids. So fatty acids has this typical long hydrocarbon chains. Okay, so you can see it's all carbon, 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 and hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. So hydrocarbons, and then at the end you have this hydroxyl group. Okay, so this is called a fatty acid. So glycerol and fatty acids are the monomers for fat. So when they are linked together, that forms triglycerides. Okay, so you can see this is the 3 carbons from glycerol, and then for each carbon you have a fatty acid tail. Okay, so tri means 3, so you have, here 3 fatty acid tails. Now they don't have to be exactly the same, so you can see this one's a little bit different, right, than the other. Okay. Fatty acids can be unsaturated or saturated. Okay, so this kind of determines which fats are good, which fats are bad. So let's look at the structure first. If all the carbons are saturated with hydrogen, okay, remember we said carbon can form 4 covalent bonds, right? So you can see 2 form with the neighboring carbons, and then the other 2 extra bonds are given to hydrogen. Okay, so this carbon is saturated with hydrogen. If you have unsaturated fatty acids, that means at some place you have a carbon forming double bonds with the neighboring carbon, right? So instead of 2 hydrogens, each carbon is only connected to 1 hydrogen. So they're not saturated with a hydrogen because of this double bond. This double bond with a neighboring carbon. Okay, so this is unsaturated fatty acids. This shows you oleic acid. So oleic acid can be found in soybean oil. Okay, one of my students, I think I showed you guys, did a study to look at whether we could replace some of the traditional motor oil with a high oleic acid, high oleic soybean oil. Okay, so in that oil, it's the oleic acid as the fatty acid tail. Okay. Now, trans just means this hydrogen are on the different sides. Okay, if they're both on here, if you move the hydrogen over here, that's called a cis. If they're on different sides, that's trans. Okay, so just different configurations. Now, can you take a guess? Which one is the healthy fat? Triglycerides with saturated fats or unsaturated fats? Right, the answer is the healthy one is usually the unsaturated fats. Okay. And again, that's because of the structure difference, right? Here, there is no double bond, right? Carbon double bond. So you can form a pretty linear carbon backbone or carbon chain, right? So it's carbon in the backbone. So it can be stacked really well. So the different fatty acid tails can be stacked really well. So they tend to be kind of solid at room temperature, like butter. Okay. And then for the unsaturated fats, because of this carbon-carbon double bond, this creates a kink in the fatty acid tail. So this way, the fats, the molecules cannot be stacked very well, right? There's kind of space in between. So because of the structure difference, the unsaturated fats tend to increase your HDL level. HDL, high density lipoprotein. Okay? And then high density lipoprotein, the HDL, will bring fats back to your liver to be destroyed, instead of leaving the fats in your arteries, right, to form plaques to clog your arteries. Okay, so unsaturated fat is associated with a high HDL level, which is good, but saturated fats is associated with LDL, low density lipoprotein, which brings fat to your arteries, to your blood vessels, to your heart, to your organs, to get deposited, and then you can get, clogged arteries, which can lead to strokes or heart disease. Okay, so here's a quick picture that kind of compares between saturated fat and unsaturated fat. Okay, so you can see it mentioned LDL and HDL. Okay, so HDL is good and LDL is bad. Okay, all right, let's move on. So omega fatty acids. So based on the structure, can you tell whether it's a saturated fat or unsaturated fat? I'll give you a few seconds. I'll give you a hint. You see there are two lines here. Usually they don't. Sometimes people just, skip writing out the C for carbon. So when you see a point right here, that indicates that there's a carbon right there. And then the two lines, that's double bond, right? So you have carbon-carbon double bond, and that's gonna be an unsaturated fat. Okay? So omega-3 fatty acids is really good for your health. And I don't think our body can produce it, so you need to get it from a diet. And then you can see, because of these carbon-carbon double bonds, it's really not linear, right? It kind of curves around. Okay. So if I give you a similar structure, can you identify whether it's saturated fat or unsaturated fat? And then you can identify which one's gonna be a good fat, which one's gonna be a bad fat. Okay. Another example for lipids is waxes. Okay, so wax covers the feathers for some aquatic birds, and also leaf surfaces for some plants. Okay? When you touch the leaf surface, it's very kind of smooth, so that's because it's covered by a wax layer. So with a wax layer, it forms a hydrophobic kind of surface, right? So that prevents water from sticking. So it's very good for aquatic birds because they don't want to get wet. If they get wet, their body temperature will drop. Okay? So they don't want to experience hypothermia. Okay, so their feathers are covered by wax, so that makes the feathers very hydrophobic. So you get water drops on, and you shake it, and the water is gone. Okay, so it keeps the body dry. Second, a very big group of lipids is called the phospholipids. Phospholipids. So phospho means it contains the element phosphorus, and it's a type of lipids. So here's the structure. Now, Just remember the basic structure. We'll talk about this in details when we talk about cell membrane. Okay, so there are two main parts. The first part is a hydrophilic head. So this circular part, this is the hydrophilic head. So based on the name, that you can tell this head likes water. So it can definitely interact in water. And it's mostly because of this phosphate group. If you remember, functional group, phosphate group carries a negative charge, so it makes it polar. So this is the polar head. And the head is connected to two fatty acid tails. Okay? So you can see if it's saturated, it's a linear structure. If it's unsaturated, there's a carbon-carbon double bond over here, it's gonna create a kink, right? So it's not as linear. So you're gonna have two fatty acid tails, and these fatty acids are non-polar. They're very hydrophobic. Okay? So if you put this phospholipid molecule in water, maybe not one, that's not gonna work. If you put a lot of these molecules in water, then they may form a structure. They may aggregate and form a structure where the fatty acid tails are going to be in the interior, and on the outside it's going to be the polar heads. Okay. All right. So remember, this is a very important component in cell membrane. Okay. So this is what it looks like. Okay. So the polar heads are on the exterior, and the non-polar tails are hiding away from water. Okay. All right. Steroids. So you guys are all know cholesterol, right? So cholesterol is a type of steroid. Now, a lot of people hate cholesterol, but you have to remember that cholesterol is also important. So for example, you guys know sex hormones, right? Testosterone, the main male hormone, male sex hormone. So all these hormones are actually made from cholesterol. So you have to have some fat, right? It's not like they're all bad. You do use some for your normal functions. You just can't have excessive amount. So remember, cholesterol is a type of fat, and specifically it's a steroid. Okay? Now we have some other applications for steroids because they can kind of reduce inflammation. So a lot of times if you have pain, like my husband had a plantar fasciitis, so they injected some kind of steroid into his foot to reduce the inflammation, to help with the healing process. Okay, so it has a lot of applications in the field of medicine.